Okay, later on the same day, which is 17th of July, 2025, and we are going to continue with our discussion of Prometheus and Epimetheus in chapter 5 of Jung's psychological types. Starting from the bottom of page 179, more or less going to move straight into this because I do want to keep covering a bit today. We've been discussing the problem of typology, introversion and extroversion, as a framing for discussing the historical split in the Western psyche. And these psychological types are represented for Jung in the characters of Prometheus and Epimetheus, as seen in the book of that title by one Carl Spitteler, and in Goethe as well. Although the qualities of the characters of Prometheus in each of Spitteler and Goethe's works are different, and Jung is drawing out these differences as a way to reveal the differences in relationship between the introverted character and the soul. And that's what we're going to be talking about. It's really a continuation of the last video. So from the bottom of 179, we were discussing before the maladaptive introversion of Spitteler's version of Prometheus and how that resulted in a unconscious vision or symbol of a renewal or rebirth of God. We're now going to turn back and look at Goethe's Prometheus by contrast. And the difference that Jung has not yet made explicit is the difference in their relationship to Pandora, or the figure of the soul. So Pandora is standing in for the soul of Prometheus in these stories. The other difference that's already been mentioned is that Goethe's Prometheus is much more creative. So where do we have that quote? He has a self-activating quality. Let's see if I can find the quote exactly. Yep, in Goethe, Prometheus is defiant, self-sufficient, godlike, God-disdaining creator and artist. And because of that, Goethe's Prometheus has a relationship with his soul as Minerva or Athena. And so this is Goethe's Prometheus has the ego strength to relate to the divine aspect of his soul in the guise of Minerva or Athena. Whereas Spitteler's Prometheus was subservient to his soul and therefore could not relate, did not have the ego strength to sort of inhabit his own divinity and relate to his soul from that level. And so this is the main difference that is again being drawn out. And the consequence of that is that Spitteler's Prometheus is far more of a suffering character, whereas Goethe's Prometheus is far more creative. Yeah, and so Jung says that in Spitteler, Pandora is a duplicate of the soul of Prometheus, who belongs to the other world, the sphere of the gods. So in Spitteler, the soul, Prometheus, has this otherworldly quality, which makes her inaccessible to real relationship. Whereas in Goethe, she is entirely the creature and daughter of the Titan Prometheus, and absolutely dependent upon him. And that's Pandora. Yeah, so to clarify, in Goethe's version of the story, Pandora is not Prometheus's soul. His soul is rather Minerva. So, because in Goethe's story, Prometheus relates to Minerva as his soul, that kind of puts him in the place of Vulcan or Hephaestus. And it gives him this, creative, artistic quality that Spitteler's Prometheus does not have. He's kind of in the position of a creator god, and that, whereas in Spitteler's version, the soul was removed from the human sphere, inaccessible to relationship. Here, Prometheus himself is removed altogether from the human sphere because of his capacity to relate to Minerva on equal terms. Hence, Prometheus says in Goethe, "And when I deemed it was myself, a goddess spoke. And when I deemed a goddess was speaking, it was myself." It's this inner divinity speaking. Yeah, and whereas by contrast, in Spitler, Prometheus is stripped of his divinity. How does this relate to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother? Well, Goethe's version is classical in the sense that because Goethe's Prometheus can relate to Minerva, his soul, Epimetheus, by contrast, is diminished. Whereas in Spitler, because Prometheus is kind of impotent in a certain way, Epimetheus is presented in a much more positive light. It's kind of equivalent to Cain and Abel, Thor and Loki. So I mentioned last time that we have two works of Goethe that are relevant. One is the fragment that we were discussing last time, and the second now emerges, Goethe's work Pandora. And so we're now discussing the positive portrayal of Epimetheus, the extroverted principle, characterized by Epimetheus, who says, "For me, day and night are not clearly divided. Always I carry the old evil of my name. My progenitors named me Epimetheus, brooding on the past with its hasty actions, glancing back, troubled in thought, to the melancholy realm of fugitive forms, interfluent with the opportunities of past days. Such bitter toil was laid on my youth, that turning impatiently towards life, I seized heedlessly the present moment, and won tormenting burdens of fresh care." So this is reminding me of the underground man in Dostoevsky. It's this brooding, looking back nature, depressive quality, full of regret. Yeah, and so this is in the myth. Yeah, he is Epimetheus here is um, comparative diminished compared to Prometheus. Like Prometheus is in the status of a godlike creator, but Epimetheus, by contrast, cannot free himself from his wife Pandora. He was tricked, and now is full of regret. And this is in some way the opposite of Prometheus' relationship with her. He had the insight to warn Epimetheus not to take her to wife, as she was sent as a trap from Zeus. Importantly, Epimetheus here, this is in Goethe's story, Pandora. Epimetheus cannot rid himself of her memory image, although she herself has long since deserted him, leaving him her daughter, Epimelia, or care, but taking with her Elpore, or hope. That's interesting. Prometheus is left with care, but has no hope. Hope, as I recall, was the heaviest um, blessing to be found in Pandora's. Um, what does she carry, Pandora? It's a box, but I've also seen it represented like as an urn or a vase. So anyway, so moving on, this is from the depiction of Epimetheus in Goethe's Pandora, who has this brooding, depressive quality, abandoned by his wife Pandora, left with care but no hope. Yeah, Epimetheus is entirely given up to fantasies, dreams, and memories, full of anxious misgivings and troubled deliberations. Yeah, and the implication is that the kind of the divinity which Epimetheus may have been unable to embody is exactly the divinity which is in relationship with Pandora. And so again, this is Vulcan or Hephaestus. So Jung quotes, Pandora appears as the creature of Hephaestus, rejected by Prometheus, but chosen by Epimetheus for a wife. He says of her, even the pains which such a treasure brings are pleasure. Pandora is to him a precious jewel of supreme value. So again, this is a way of like Epimetheus is kind of ma making an equivalent mistake as Spittler's Prometheus did, of overvaluing Pandora and therefore being in a kind of subservient relationship and therefore unable to inhabit his own godlike status, not able to take the place of Vulcan or Hephaestus, and therefore unable to be in deepest relationship with Pandora. Yeah, there's another long verse which I won't quote, which shows that for Epimetheus in Goethe, Pandora has the value of a soul image. She stands for his soul. Yeah, so that um, so Epimetheus is projecting his soul image upon Pandora and is therefore unable to be in deep relationship with her. She's a symbol carrier. So just to say briefly that what these characters represent in each of Spitler and Goethe is different. We talked about in Spitler, like Prometheus represents the introversion of the author, the maladaptive introversion, whereas Epimetheus in that story is presented as the functional extrovert. Whereas in Goethe's story, um, Epimetheus is presented as the brooding introvert, and Prometheus is the uh, again functional extrovert. So Goethe's Prometheus is in extroverted form, what Spidler's Prometheus is in introverted form, which reveals the types of the two authors. So in Goethe's Prometheus, Prometheus is creative for collective ends, meaning that he's cut off from his inner world in a way. And so the relationship with the inner world falls to Epimetheus, the reactive thinking and feeling of the extrovert, which possess all the characteristics of the undifferentiated function. And that comes about because Epimetheus is at the mercy of Pandora, as we talked about, because she's superior to him. Yeah, and again, that had to do with the relationship between Epimetheus and his soul. And so that has the psychological meaning, according to Jung, that the quote, that the unconscious Epimethean function of the extrovert, namely that fantastic brooding ruminative fancy, is intensified by the intervention of the soul. Okay, so if the soul is coupled with the less differentiated function, one must conclude that the superior differentiated function is too collective. It's the servant of the collective conscience, not the servant of freedom. Yeah, so it's like this because Prometheus, as the sort of more differentiated function, is serving two collective ends. It means that the less differentiated function, represented by Epimetheus and his reactive thinking and feeling, is the servant of the soul. So the implication would be that the well-differentiated uh, function of Goethe's Prometheus is actually serving a too collective end and needs to focus more on his own individuality. Jung says, whenever this is so, and it happens very frequently, the less differentiated function or the other side is reinforced by pathological egocentricity. I have to say, I relate to this very much. It says the extrovert then fills up his time with melancholic or hypochondriacal brooding. It's not really me. And may even have hysterical fantasies or other symptoms, while the introvert grapples with compulsive feelings of inferiority, which take him unawares and put him in a no less dismal plight. Definitely true of me. Sometimes compensated by a morbid and feverish activity, which likewise serves the purpose of repression. Also true of me, I would say. And so the implication would be, yeah, can I take my introverted intuition and direct it toward the service of, let's say, my own soul, rather than the service of the collective ends, which are nominally what I'm oriented towards. We're going to move on here. Just to conclude Goethe's story, because we were talking about Spitler and then veered into Goethe. We're going back to towards Spitler. So apparently in Goethe's story, Prometheus and Epimetheus become reconciled when the industriousness of Prometheus is shown to be nothing but unadmitted eroticism, and Epimetheus' constant broodings on the past to be rational misgivings, which might have checked the unremitting productivity of Prometheus and kept it within reasonable bounds. It's quite interesting. So it's again this like moving towards this symbol of the reconciliation or mediating function, attempt to bridge the gap between these two in some way. It's Goethe's attempt to find a solution, which seems to have evolved from his extroverted psychology, according to Jung. So we're now going to turn back to Spitler's Prometheus, who turned away from the world. So it's this maladaptive introversion, excuse me. So turning away from the world toward himself. So Jung, again, this is for Jung, we talked about already the symbol of the self, which first emerged really on page 114 of the present work, which is in chapter 2. It's about the 1 hour 12 mark of the my discussion of chapter 2. But here, that self is symbolized like by the basic mandala, which is like a circle with a dot in the middle. It's like the most simple version of the mandala. And so introversion in this case is like a focus on the dot in the center of the mandala rather than the circumference. And so that's what is meant when Jung says on page 183, Spitler's Prometheus, like his god, turns away from the world, from the periphery, and gazes inward to the center, the narrow passage of rebirth. It's a standing graph as well. This concentration or introversion pipes the libido into the unconscious. The activity of the unconscious is increased. The psyche begins to work and creates a product that wants to get out of the unconscious into consciousness. Yeah, and I would say the psyche begins to work quality, the introversion of the libido is really connected with the function of Hephaestus or Vulcan. Again, it's the forging quality, like the hammering, working quality is within the unconscious itself. Consciously, Prometheus, the character of Prometheus in the story, is not able to inhabit his divinity, and that's why he ends up in this profound introversion. And that means that the work, namely Vulcan's work, in hammering the jewel together, is taking place in the unconscious. Yeah, and so from this point of view, it's a distinction between the introverted and extroverted ways of adapting to the world from the point of view of the introvert, where the consciousness actually has two attitudes. It's the Promethean attitude, which withdraws the libido from the world, introverting it toward oneself, and the Epimethean attitude, which is giving out toward the world, responding in a soulless fashion, fascinated by the claims of external objects. So again, this introversion is orientation toward the self, and uh, extroversion is orientation toward the world. And what that means is that when Pandora eventually makes her gift to the world, as we were talking about toward the end of the last video on this topic, it means that an unconscious product of great value is on the point of reaching the extroverted consciousness. It's seeking a relation to the real world. So ultimately, we're hoping that the profound and maladaptive, in a sense, introversion of Prometheus in this story is resulting in a new center of consciousness from which greater adaptation to the world can be achieved. Yeah, and so, but one of the problems there is that although like someone's artistic side can appreciate a work of that nature, their personal relations to the world end up being subordinated to the tyranny of tradition. And that means that whatever this great work is that's produced, it's produced merely as a work of art and not taken for what it actually is, which is a symbol that promises a renewal of life. again, it's like this devolution into the aesthetic realm rather than maintaining its quality as a religious solution. Yeah, and so in order to transform it from a purely aesthetic interest into a living reality, it must be assimilated into life and actually lived, which is why Jung is so insistent to point out that the products of the unconscious fantasy are not artistic. They have a natural function. Yeah, and so the problem here is that it was this profound introversion that led to this jewel being created in the first place, but this means that the extroversion in such a character is inferior and in the grip of collective restraints. And it means that these restraints actually prevent the symbol created by the psyche from living. Um, because the profound introvert has a maladaptive extroverted side, that means that the jewel gets lost. But one cannot really live if God, the supreme vital value that is expressed in the symbol, cannot become a living fact. Hence, the loss of the jewel signifies at the same time the beginning of Epimetheus's downfall. Yeah, and so just to say that although it's this introversion that produces the jewel, the symbol of the jewel, it's bringing that jewel into the world through the extroverted function that allows new life to be found. It allows this new center of consciousness, this new, again, emerging God to actually be lived. In the story, this essentially means that Prometheus is suffering a great deal, and his brother Epimetheus, who is successful, was unable to appreciate the value of what Prometheus was able to produce. That eventually led to a reversion to the opposite, an antiodromia, that leads to Epimetheus's downfall, despite his prior success, where um, yeah, I think in the story this would be equivalent to Epimetheus was unable to take the advice of Prometheus to not take Pandora to wife, and therefore got very curious about the treasure that Pandora came with, and when opening it, found all these horrible ills and sufferings. But Jung says Epimetheus, the man of blameless conscience and universally acknowledged moral principles, makes a pact with Behemoth and his evil host, and even the divine children entrusted to his care are bartered to the devil. Psychologically, this means that the collective undifferentiated attitude to the world stifles a man's highest values and becomes a destructive force, whose influence increases until the Promethean side, the ideal and abstract attitude, places itself at the service of the soul's jewel, and like a true Prometheus, kindles for the world a new fire. So it's that the extroverted side of the personality is completely unable to appreciate the highest values that one's introverted side is able to produce, and it is therefore only the reliance on that introverted side that is able to honor those values and to allow them to forge a new life from the ashes of the previous world. Yeah, which means that Spittler's Prometheus has to come out of his solitude and tell men, even at the risk of his life, that they are in error and where they are. He must acknowledge the pitilessness of truth, just as Goethe's Prometheus has to experience in Phileros the pitilessness of love. And yeah, to an extent, I mean, this is kind of what I'm up to, actually. I mean, yeah, I mean, there has to be a kind of arrogance about that, I think, for it to really get across. In any case, that will come up more when we talk about the transcendent functions. I'm going to leave that for now. Yeah, and so, I mean, Jung makes the obvious connection to the religion of our present day, where um, the ways and customs of childhood, once so sublimely good, can hardly be laid aside, even when their harmfulness has long been proven. The same, only on a gigantic scale, is true of historical attitudes of change, historical changes of attitude. A collective attitude is equivalent to a religion, and changes of religion constitute one of the most painful chapters in the world's history. In this respect, our age is affected with a blindness that has no parallel. We entirely forget that the religion of the last 2,000 years is a psychological attitude, a definite form and manner of adaptation to the world without and within, that lays down a definite cultural pattern and creates an atmosphere which remains wholly uninfluenced by any intellectual denials. Like, essentially, what we're unpacking here is the relevance of this story to the actual real world. Jung's obviously connecting this with his own process of the discovery of the emergence of the self. But I mean, we can just take that as a metaphor or analogy for whatever is going on in our time in the world. Yeah, so we're just coming to the end of this section, and essentially it's this, we're saying that this religious attitude uh, is a manner of adaptation to the world. So it's a way that the world actually appears to us. So like it's a bit hard to it's not something to be explained. It's like the split that we're talking about is actually something that we participate in all the time. Um, for me, the most obvious version of it is the subject-object split. We tend to feel that we are somewhere behind our eyes here, and that there's a whole world out there which is not us. There's this deep separateness, and we're saying that that's actually a product of our metaphysics, our religion, and for us to recognize that this has been in error, and to change our not only change our religion, but to change our understanding of ourself and world. It requires a lot of effort and a lot of persistence and Promethean qualities. Okay, and so yeah, in the symbols of Prometheus and Epimetheus, Schiller sought to kind of solve this problem, and it's kind of philosophically and aesthetically clothed in the garment of a classical myth, according to Jung. Yeah, Jung points out that something that happens typically is that when there's like a conflict between opposites that cannot be mastered, there's typically like a regression to a previous state, and where the libido is introverted away from the problem and reactivates in unconscious form, a more or less primitive analogy of the conscious situation. And so we saw how in Goethe's time that was sort of picked out by a return to the classical spirit, namely the Renaissance. And so this was given a sort of compensatory value, um, a sort of return, or yeah, compensation by return to the paganism of antiquity, which was glorified as freedom, naivety, beauty, and so on, that kind of met the yearnings of that age, the age of the Renaissance, the age of the Renaissance. And as Schiller shows, this sort of sprang from a feeling of imperfection, spiritual barbarism, moral servitude, drabness. And this is exactly what led to the one-sided evaluation of everything Greek, because this psychological split between the differentiated and undifferentiated functions, or what Jung thinks of really as introversion and extroversion, became so obvious. Um, Trouble is that, yeah, and it was sort of that had been exacerbated by Christianity, which had really divided man into one valuable half and one sort of depraved half. And this was the reason for this. That split was sort of unbearable, and that was the reason for this return, this regression of the Renaissance in a way, which didn't really work. It was stillborn, um, and the reason for that is because the classical solution wouldn't work any longer, because the intervening centuries of Christianity, with their profound spiritual upheavals, could not be undone. Um, yeah, and there's a sort of like response to the feeling of split in the psyche. in the culture as well, where the Renaissance is a return to the last previous place that things were supposed to be working. And the reason that that return failed is that Christianity had really enforced this split between good and evil. For its reason, a return to sort of pagan values couldn't really work. There was no way for the heights and depths of human nature to still dwell together um, without offending moral or aesthetic susceptibilities. And that means that the uh, Renaissance sort of petered out in medievalism, according to Jung, and that there then ends up being a divine wager between good and evil, where this like deep split is like taken up into Goethe with this uh, contrast between Faust and Mephistopheles. Um, Faust ends up being like the medieval Prometheus, and Mephistopheles is the medieval Epimetheus, and they make a pact. So much that we can see that they're actually the same person. And so the Epimethean principle has sort of, yeah, always thinks backwards and reduces everything to primal chaos of interpolate forms, condenses into the devil. So that it takes up this Christ and Satan polarity, which is like an even stronger version of the same dichotomy in a sense. Yeah, so it says, Jung says, yes, this Epimethean principle condenses into the devil whose evil power threatens everything living with the devil's cold fist and would force back the light into the maternal darkness whence it was born. The devil everywhere displays a true Epimethean thinking, a thinking in terms of nothing but, which reduces all to nothing. Yep. Anyway, that's just like an elaboration of the same theme. Last page of this section, where the Promethean defiance of the gods, which we saw in Spidler, for example, ends up being personified by the alchemist or indeed the medieval magician. So it's this heretical um, playing with fire that is very much not part of the orthodoxy of the church. It's this against the, it's this more alchemical, heretical, magical quality. So Jung says that the magician has preserved in himself a trace of primitive paganism. He possesses a nature that is still unaffected by the Christian dichotomy and is still in touch with the still pagan unconscious, is in touch with the still pagan unconscious, where the opposites lie side by side in their original naive state, beyond the reach of sinfulness, but liable, if assimilated into conscious life, to beget evil as well as good with the same demonic energy. He is a destroyer, but also a savior, and such a figure is preeminently suited to become the symbolic bearer of an attempt to resolve the conflict. Yeah. Yeah, this original unconscious state where opposites lie side by side in their original naive state is really reminding me of a quote from Jung's Dreams, which I will quote here, page 234, in which Maria Prophetessa, firstly, this is related to the problem of three and four, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, which was tackled by Goethe in great depth. And in relation to this, Maria says, one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. And this, what is the meaning of this in this context? Well, yeah, this is connected with the return to paganism. So um, the significance of out of the third comes the one as the fourth is this nature returning into consciousness. So this healing of the split between subject and object, between good and evil, is symbolized as out of the third comes the one as the fourth. And where these opposites, like self and world, subject and object, masculine and feminine, end up lying side by side in their original state, beyond the reach of sinfulness. This is connected with the a vision of Maria. This is from the Gnostic Gospels, where this vision is said to describe a vision of how Christ on a mountain caused a woman to come forth from his side and how he mingled himself with her. Yeah, and so it's a kind of concretization or realization of the soul, I would say, which is really dependent on the manifest presence of the soul of nature. But it's not just the soul of nature, it's also the soul of the world. But in any case, I'm not going to go too much into this right now. I'm going to return. So just to finish this off, this is this we're talking about this return to reintegrating paganism, essentially solving the split by going back to the level of culture that um, is actually capable of resolving it without making a regression. And that's the question: how can we avoid a regression? How do we preserve the gains of consciousness that have been made in the time in the Christian era? Well, it's the figure of the magician that Jung feels is able to move forwards with this because they have laid aside the classical naivety that was no longer possible and become thoroughly steeped in the Christian atmosphere. Yeah. I mean, this is Jung as the Gnostic, right? So it's like in the end, the Christian attempt at a solution fails too, and it then transpires that the possibility of redemption lies precisely in the obstinate persistence of the old pagan element, because the anti-Christian symbol opens the way for an acceptance of evil. Yeah, it's also significant in this context that the more superficial attempts at a solution to this problem didn't really work. Prometheus's fragment and Pandora, like none of these attempts in Goethe really work out. And Rosicrucianism also doesn't really work out, this blend of Dionysian joyousness and Christian self-sacrifice. It's kind of uncompleted. Not clear why, but in any case, with Faust in Goethe, his redemption began at his death, where we can see the Faustian attitude had to be abandoned before the individual could become an integrated whole. Yeah, and so that it was coincided with the image, the emergence of a certain image, initially appearing as Gretchen, and then on a high level as Helen. It's this Gnostic feminine symbol at the heart of Gnosticism, the image of the divine harlot Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia, all connected with that. So we're going to pause here and just say that that was a discussion of introversion and extroversion, this split in the Western psyche, and how they became, how they were represented in these stories of Prometheus and Epimetheus in Spitteler and Goethe, how the Renaissance as an attempt to solve that split did not really work, and the um, how Goethe really took up the problem which had been exacerbated by Christianity into the problem of good and evil, really. So good and evil connected with introversion and extroversion. And for Jung, this solution, this split requires a yeah, reintegration of everything that has been repressed from our consciousness. And so this, for me, is really connected with the symbolism of yeah, three reintegrating three and four, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, self and world, or could say human and natural or nature. And that discussion finally allows us to move into why. What is it about returning to paganism that Jung feels will be helpful? And moreover, if one is to reintegrate a pagan element without succumbing to the Dionysian fate of Nietzsche, how? How can this be done? And so, it's all very well to prescribe paganism and say, oh, we have to go back, this reversion to the way things used to be. But this is a very dangerous move to make. And there are certain risks, namely the risks of possession. And yeah, Dionysus as a solution is not exactly certainly wasn't successful for Nietzsche. And so the question for Jung is how? How do we do this and why? And that really allows us to approach the symbol of the significance of the uniting symbol. So there's a way that for Jung, returning to that level of consciousness, if you like, or that it's just not just a level of consciousness, it's a acceptance of a forgotten or repressed part of oneself, but it's also a return to a previous sociological form. So again, I've argued in other places that we can't reason that going back to ancient Greece doesn't work is because we were already in the agrarian era and already subject to the over differentiation into different functions that is the product of yeah, psychological and sociological adaptation at that level of culture. And so that means that if we want to return to a different way of living, we need to know how and why to do so, and how is that connected with the uniting symbol in Jung? What is it about symbols that can be uniting of these different qualities, good and evil, introversion and extroversion, and why is it so important? And that allows us to move into part three of this chapter before we get into some Eastern conceptions of the uniting symbol. So it goes into section three, part A, B, and C, and so on. But it's just section three at the moment, which is from page 189 in psychological types. Yeah, and so again, we to clarify the reason for the downfall in Spitler's presentation of the problem was not because of Prometheus, who successfully produced the jewel through his profound introversion. It was because of the thoughtlessness of Epimetheus, the extroverted function, who merely possessed a collective adaptation and had no power of discrimination in regard to the things of the inner world. And that meant that the thing of highest value was not valued properly. And that means that collective values can't really help us. So Jung says that current collective values can certainly be measured by an objective criterion, but only a free and individual assessment, a matter of living feeling, can give the true measure of something newly created. It also needs a man who has a soul and not merely relations to objects. Yeah, so ultimately I think if this new if something new has been produced, which certainly to me it feels that it has at this point, the question is, can we feel that? And how does it feel? Can we do it not in service to objects, but can it be done in a soulful way? Is it genuinely a source of life and renewal? Because if so, it's something that people will be able to participate in and feel in their participation. It's something that can be shown rather than something to be told. For me, it's deeply connected with that quote that I mentioned from Maria earlier, from one, two, from two, three, from three comes the one as the fourth. But I won't go on about that now. We're going to keep discussing Jung's take on this thing. So again, in Spitler, Epimetheus has a downfall. It's this this extroverted quality is not able to recognize the source of living value, and therefore his downfall begins with the loss of the newborn God image. yeah, his thinking and feeling don't prevent the evil and destructive element from creeping in and gaining the upper hand. Again, it's like as a little analogy to explain this, like this is in the book Dune and in the movie Dune as well now, like Paul Atreides was very afraid of pursuing the um call to adventure that would lead him to the south of Arrakis. And the reason for that is because he was afraid of a jihad, which did in fact come to pass. Like his ascent to power went along with a great amount of evil and suffering coming into the world, and he um, found it impossible to prevent that. It's a kind of invasion of evil, signifying that something previously good has turned into something harmful. And that's why Paul Atreides ends up as a revolutionary, destroying his own empire from without. Anyway, I won't go on about that. Moving in to page 189. Yeah, the divine birth is an event altogether outside the bounds of rationality. What's rational is too narrow a concept to grasp life in its totality, so it's something that's difficult to appreciate. Yeah, so this is expressing the idea that it's a new symbol, a new expression of life at its most intense is being created. And so everyone who's more extroverted and adapted to the world as it is it's very difficult for people like that to appreciate something like this, I would say. And yet it is the case that from that moment of creation, the highest intensity of life is to be found only in this new direction. Yes, and importantly, how does that symbol arise? Well, the new life-giving symbol springs from Prometheus' love for his soul mistress, a demonic figure indeed. So it's again this quality of creative activity that is a product of the relationship with the soul, right relationship with the soul, where both oneself and one soul can contribute to a creative process. Yeah. And unfortunately, one can therefore be certain that interwoven with the new symbol and its living beauty, there will also be the element of evil, for otherwise it would lack the glow of life as well as beauty, since life and beauty are by nature morally neutral. So it ends up being a quality to look for. Yeah, and so then Jung then goes on to talk about the importance of poets who are always the first to divine the darkly moving, mysterious currents and to express them as best they can in symbols that speak to us. Yeah, they make known, like true prophets, the stirrings of the collective unconscious, or in the language of the Old Testament, the will of God, which in the course of time must inevitably come to the surface as a collective phenomenon. Jung goes on to simply talk about how, for genuinely creative people, they're able to discern the symbols of new adaptation to the world long before they spread to everyone else. And this means that they end up being very difficult to understand. They, although they see more clearly and resoundingly what all men know, and they give expression to that universal knowledge, they are also very difficult to comprehend depending how far down into what Jung calls the collective unconscious they reach. Anyway, to move on, it's important that the poets often have only an aesthetic appreciation for their own work, and it's like important to recognize that, as per the discussion of, for example, the Apollonian, Dionysian, and Nietzsche, the aesthetic solution to the problem is insufficient. It's a religious or metaphysical problem. It has to do with how we view ourselves and the world. It's a religious solution. We can see that in both Faust and in Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Again, what Jung goes back to is that the what is first and foremost revealed in Spitler's portrayal of unconscious religious contents is a symbol of God's renewal, and that appears to be intimately connected with the opposition between psychological types and functions. So it's not just a yeah, wow. I mean, that is quite just appreciating what that really means. Like this, the solution to this split in the Western psyche, this going back to um, reintegration of paganism to some degree. It's not just a way to blend um, unconscious and conscious, or masculine and feminine, or introversion and extroversion. It's actually a process by which God is renewed. Yeah, and the symbols of that. And so in Spitaler, this symbol appears to be intimately connected with the opposition between psychological types and functions, and is obviously an attempt to find a solution in the form of a renewal of the general attitude, which in the language of an unconscious is expressed as a renewal of God. Yeah, and that is there's a whole mythological complex of the dying and renewing God. This is a very old motif, universal, you know. It expresses a transformation of attitude by means of which a new potential, a new manifestation of life, a new fruitfulness is created. Yeah, it's a renewal of life, and this goes all the way back to Eliade, who I'm going to talk about in other contexts, Gary Clark as well. Say nothing of Neumann. So there's a connection here between the renewal of the god and seasonal or vegetational phenomena. So there's like natural rhythms, natural cycles. The New Year's festival, for example, thinking of Eliade as the forge and the crucible. So it's like the seasonal, vegetational, lunar, and solar myths underlie these analogies. So it's like, yeah, I think this mythological imagery that is connected with the rebirth of God is connected with the myths and symbols that originally adhered to natural cycles, ones that we have forgotten in our disconnection from the natural world. Yeah, importantly here, this would be to forget that a myth, like everything psychic, cannot be solely conditioned by external events. Anything psychic brings its own internal conditions with it. So this is what's gonna help us to avoid the pre-trans fallacy. It's like again, we want to avoid making a regression all the way back to the way things used to be. We want to also be able to move forwards, or again, consolidate the gains in consciousness that have been made since that time, let's say. Yeah, and so that gives us a way of expressing that this myth is kind of purely psychological and can sort of use meteorological or astronomical events purely to give expression to uh, inner events. Yeah, and so the way that this um, renewal of God is manifesting in the formation of a creative symbol in our time, according to Jung, is this um, further deployment of psychic energy into the two forms of the split, namely into this Promethean introverted direction and this Epimethean extroverted direction. And accordingly, like that split becomes quite the issue for the individual and for society as well. And according to Jung, this means again that we're seeking for a middle way. This vital optimum withdraws more and more from these opposing extremes. And Jung, yeah, so there's again, I've talked about this in the context of Viveki, right? It's like dialectic into dialogos as a way to uh, reunify any given pair of opposites. So there's a way to draw any polarity into a dynamic process that can allow one to disidentify with those pairs and to make oneself transparent by doing so to unlock more spaciousness, which is kind of equivalent in this context to finding a middle way. a way between to hold two opposites in creative tension rather than to be drawn into either polarity. And Jung says that this middle way is naturally irrational and unconscious, just because the opposites are rational and conscious. So again, dividing things into polarities is this quality of differentiation, right? So Jung saying that finding this middle way, there has to be a proper integration of differentiation and integration. And so this is why Jung is focusing on these symbols, because it's like, again, this main problem that Jung's been talking about is this differentiation into different functions. And so the reunification or reintegration of them involves a return to symbolic language, essentially. What used to be the functionality of shamanism appreciated in new forms, in new terms. Um, yeah, because that middle position it's a function of mediation between the opposites, and produces an irrational it possesses an irrational character, and it's mostly still unconscious, and for that reason it usually appears projected in the form of a mediating god or messiah. Yeah, the new bearers of life, like in what Jung calls our primitive forms of Western religion, like the new bearer of life appears as a god or savior, and so there's a way that well, Christ appeared, didn't he? And that like the thing about him is that he was a symbol, but then a lot of people get kind of caught up in the imitation of Christ and um the claim that he was in fact God himself. And it's like the whole point of him being a living symbol is that um we don't have to bow down in front of Christ in order to see what he was getting at and kind of work out how to emulate him or move in the same direction. So again, Jung's sort of working with this dichotomy of this like conscious multiplicity, which is differentiated, underneath which there's an unconscious unity, which is undifferentiated. And these are in a dynamic process. So this is a bridge to Viveki from here. Yeah, and so Jung makes this comparison that he thinks that this projection in the form of the Messiah figure is very childish, and that he says that the East has for of years been familiar with this process and has founded it on a psychological doctrine of salvation, which brings the way of deliverance within man's canon capacity. So he's going to start talking about India and China, particularly Buddhism. They possess the idea of a redemptive middle way of magical efficacy, which is attainable by means of a conscious attitude. So the Vedic conception is a conscious attempt to find release from the pairs of opposites in order to reach the path of redemption. And so I'm just wondering whether this is a mistake again by Jung. Again, I argued in the discussion of chapter 2 that um, I don't know that modern Western people are really suited to simply adopt Eastern forms. And I'm not exactly sure that Jung is advocating for that, but the question is, well, Jung, we've been sort of trying to learn from the East for a very long time. Um, how are we actually able to do this in a way that is suitable to our own psychology rather than the psychology of Easterners, which is very different? So again, I talked about Jung has this sort of bias toward introversion and sort of conceives of these Eastern ways as very introverted orientation towards introversion in the same way that he has, which I think is a misreading, a misunderstanding. Yeah, so this had to do with page 118 of psychological types and is in the last sort of half an hour of or so, maybe 45 minutes of my discussion of chapter 2, in which Jung is very focused on this inward way. Um, I'm going to quote to be clear from page 118. He says, um, the Indian conception teaches liberation from the opposites, by which are to be understood every sort of affective state and emotional tie to the object. Liberation follows the withdrawal of libido from all contents, resulting in a state of complete introversion. This psychological process is very characteristically known as tapas, a term which can be best be rendered as self-brooding. This expression clearly pictures the state of meditation without content, in which the libido is supplied to one's own self, somewhat in the manner of incubating heat. As a result of the complete detachment of all affective ties to the object, this is necessarily formed in the inner self, an equivalent of objective reality, or a complete identity of inside and outside, which is technically described as tatvamasi, that art thou. The fusion of the self with its relations to the object produces the identity of the self, Atman, with the essence of the world, i.e., with the relations of subject to object, so that the identity of the inner with the outer Atman is cognized. The concept of Brahman differs only slightly from that of Atman, for in Brahman the idea of the self is not explicitly given. Goes on, but just to say that I think all this can be reversed, like as much as there is I think like Jung is here misunderstanding, Eastern liberation as withdrawal of libido from all contents. It's not exactly a state of introversion. It's also a withdrawal of libido from inner objects, and from the subject also, as well as the object. There's like Jung's talking about this way via introversion, and I think there must also be a way that's possible via extroversion, like a via positiva rather than a via negativa, that I think is far more suited to the Western psyche, the Western character. Like they're talking here about this complete detachment of all effective affective ties to the object, and I think there must, by contrast, be full participation in the world, which is totally possible. And I don't know that Jung has clarified that. Like he seems blind in some way to the ties to the subject, unwilling to let himself go in some way, inability to surrender. And so I think this importing of Eastern analogies is not necessarily helpful. But I want to say that they can be taken as symbols, which is kind of the whole point. The point is here is that all these different symbols of the union of opposites of the mediating transcendent function point in a similar direction. They point to the self, which is before and beyond them. Like um, symbols point to the light by which things can be seen. They point to the eye which cannot see itself. They point to the fire which cannot burn itself, the knife that cannot cut itself. They point in this way. But I think it's kind of by adding them all to reveal what is behind and before them, rather than by removing them all, that I think we will get somewhere. Anyway, from here, I'm going to pause and come back at a different time to part A in section 3 of chapter 5, which is entitled The Brahmanic Conception of the Problem of Opposites, from page 195.